Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive, brought to you by Safety One Source. Today, for all our safety folks out there, and really anyone who, wants to, really dive deeper into workplace safety with us, we're tackling a topic that's kind of a big one, construction safety, but specifically those all-important definitions in OSHA regulations. We're zeroing in on 29 CFR 1926, and specifically Section .13. It's like the ABCs of making sure everyone goes home safe at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And, for those of you out there working in the field, you already know that, right? Getting these terms down isn't just about checking boxes for compliance. It's the foundation of a truly safe work environment, any construction project.
Couldn't agree more. And what gets really interesting, at least for me, is realizing that these definitions, they're not just floating out there in isolation.
Right. Right.
It's like when we talk about construction, alteration, repair, how OSHA uses them, they're not just, made up on the spot. They actually connect back to definitions in other big pieces of legislation. We're talking about the Davis-Bacon Act, the Miller Act.
Yeah, and it's not just about having consistent language. It's about precedent. You see how these laws, Davis-Bacon is all about fair wages on federal projects. Miller Act focuses on, those performance and payment bonds. They all use similar language. It shows a very deliberate alignment, and that has big implications for OSHA, especially Section 107.
Makes total sense, especially when you think, okay, if there's a legal question about what construction actually means, say, under Davis-Bacon, well, that interpretation could easily have weight when you're looking at safety obligations under OSHA.
Exactly. It's all about reducing ambiguity and making sure that safety enforcement has solid legal ground to stand on. So we've got this consistent language, this shared understanding, but then there's a really interesting kind of a divergence when you start looking at who these laws protect.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point. It's something that always kind of jumps out at me. So Davis-Bacon, for example, it's very specific. It limits its wage protection to laborers and mechanics who are, and I'm quoting here, employed directly at the site of the work.
Right. And here's the thing. OSHA Section 107, it doesn't have that same, really tight restriction. It actually takes a much wider view. When you look at Section 107, it makes it clear every contract covered under it has this built-in condition. No contractor or subcontractor can require any laborer or mechanic involved in the contract to work in conditions that are unsafe or unhealthy, period.
So OSHA's casting a wider net for safety, it sounds like, than Davis-Bacon does for wages.
You got it. It's not just about those folks directly on the immediate work site. The responsibility to ensure safe working conditions, it extends to every laborer and mechanic contributing to the project. It doesn't matter, what their specific employment arrangement is under Davis-Bacon. And, at the end of the day, that really underscores OSHA's core mission, right? Protecting everyone involved in that construction, alteration, or repair work.
So let's talk about, who actually fits the definition of a subcontractor under OSHA, because it's a bit of a maze to navigate.
It is, yeah.
It's one of those terms that, anyone working in safety really needs to get their head around, especially when you're on a complex job site trying to figure out who's accountable for what.
Absolutely. And thankfully, OSHA 1926.13c lays it out pretty clearly. Even references a landmark Supreme Court case, McAvoy-Koch v. United States. And basically what it boils down to is this. A subcontractor is anyone who agrees to perform any part of the labor or material requirements of a construction, alteration, or repair contract.
Okay. Any part. So we're not just talking about like the folks on site swinging hammers, using their tools, right? It's broader than that.
It is. And to break that down a little further, OSHA gives us two specific situations where a supplier, someone providing materials, would actually be considered a subcontractor. The first one is pretty straightforward. It comes down to location.
Right. The directly on or near clause. I remember this one. But how do we, practically speaking, how does this actually play out?
Well, it's pretty intuitive. So if the work of providing those materials, those supplies, is actually carried out directly on the construction site or even, really close to it, that supplier could be classified as a subcontractor. Think about a company that doesn't just deliver steel beams, but they're the ones actually erecting them as part of their contract. That on-site erection work, that would likely qualify them.
Okay, makes sense. So it's about physical work on or near the site, and it's integral to the project. That's what makes them a subcontractor. What about that second situation you mentioned? What's the other trigger?
The second situation is a little bit more, nuanced. And it all comes down to whether the employer is fabricating or assembling goods or materials specifically for that particular project. And here's the kicker. even if that fabrication is happening, off-site at some distant facility. If it's custom made for this project, they're in.
So off-site, but custom made for this project. That's the key distinction.
Exactly.
Any examples to help us, really visualize this?
Yeah, absolutely. Think about a company that designs and fabricates ventilation systems. They're making these ducts in their shop, right? But they're doing it according to the precise specifications of this building's plans, the exact bends, the sizes, the materials, it's all custom. Even if their shop is miles away in another state, they'd likely be considered a subcontractor because their work is so intertwined with that specific construction project. It's all about that bespoke nature, the tailoring to this exact project. That's what triggers the subcontractor definition.
Makes sense. Now, what would be, I guess, the opposite of that? Like, who wouldn't typically fall into this definition? What kind of supplier?
A good example would be, your typical lumber supplier. They're providing lumber, sure, and it'll be used in construction, but it's part of their regular stock. They sell it to tons of different contractors for all sorts of projects. They wouldn't usually be considered a subcontractor in this case because, well, there's no specific fabrication or assembly happening just for this project.
Got it. So it's that difference between, like, customized and off the shelf.
Yeah, you got it.
Now, what about those pre-engineered trusses or structural steel components? Those are obviously essential for a lot of construction projects. How do those typically fit into this definition?
So generally, just supplying pre-engineered trusses or your standard structural steel, straight from a production line, that's usually considered manufacturing. Mm-hmm. A company that's just providing those materials as part of their normal product offerings, they wouldn't usually be classified as a subcontractor under this specific OSHA definition. Again, it goes back to that emphasis on fabrication or assembly that's done specifically to meet the unique design requirements of this one particular construction project.
Okay. And what about companies what about those that just rent or sell construction equipment? So if a contractor, leases a crane from a specialized equipment supplier, does that automatically make that equipment supplier a subcontractor as far as OSHA is concerned?
Generally not. A contract that's just for providing construction equipment, that alone usually doesn't make the supplier a subcontractor under OSHA. It goes back to that idea of who's directly contributing to the labor or the actual incorporation of materials into the construction, alteration, or repair work itself. That's where the focus lies.
All right. So we spent some time, really breaking down these definitions. Who's a contractor? Who's a subcontractor? But for those of you listening, who are out there actually making sure work sites are safe, why does all this matter? Why should we care about these, kind of legalistic distinctions?
It's all about responsibility. Knowing exactly who falls under the definition of a contractor or a subcontractor, that tells us who has those specific legal obligations under OSHA, who's got to make sure those working conditions are safe. That clarity, that's crucial for, effective safety management and making sure OSHA can actually enforce its rules.
Right. Right. And that customized basis rule, that one seems particularly important. It's like our safety concerns, they shouldn't just stop at the edge of this physical construction site. Right.
Exactly. The customized basis rule, it forces us to think bigger. If a subcontractor is busy fabricating essential, project-specific components off-site, the safety practices they're using, they directly impact the quality and safety of whatever they're bringing onto the construction site, right? So while that prime contractor, they're still ultimately responsible, knowing who these off-site subcontractors are, it allows for better communication, coordination. You might even do site visits to make sure those off-site processes are up to par. And to be honest, this little distinction has actually been at the heart of some big legal battles where figuring out if someone's a manufacturer or a subcontractor really mattered when it came to assigning responsibility after an incident.
Yeah, it makes you think. So it's not just some theoretical thing. It can have some real world consequences. And I guess it also really underscores that, safety is kind of a chain. Everyone's a link. Even those working remotely, if they're making custom parts for the project, they're part of that chain.
Absolutely, and that's really the point here. These definitions, they help us get away from thinking about safety in silos. We need to see that shared responsibility across everyone who's contributing to the construction, alteration, or repair work. It takes a village.
Right, it takes a village. So to kind of wrap up our deep dive today, we started by looking at how OSHA defines those key terms in construction safety. Construction, alteration, repair, contractor, subcontractor. And we saw how those definitions are really strategically aligned with those other major labor laws, like Davis-Bacon and the Miller Act. It all works together to create a more consistent legal landscape.
Exactly.
We also talk about that critical difference in scope of protection. Davis-Bacon focuses on wages for folks employed directly on site, but OSHA Section 107, it casts that wider net for safety, covering any laborer or mechanic involved in the contract. It doesn't matter how they're employed.
Right. And then we dove into the specifics of that subcontractor definition under OSHA, focusing on those two key triggers: work happening right there on or near the construction site, and the fabrication or assembly of custom-made goods specifically for the project. And that last one, it doesn't matter if that work is happening off-site.
Yeah. And as we discussed, understanding all these nuances, it's not just about, passing a quiz. It's crucial for folks working in safety. It clarifies who's got those safety responsibilities, and it helps us see that safety management needs to go beyond just the physical boundaries of the construction site.
It does, yeah.
So here's a final thought for you as you leave us today. Given these really specific definitions, how would you maybe rethink how safety responsibilities are divided up and managed on your own construction projects? And thinking about that customized basis rule, could clear communication, more specific language in your contracts with suppliers, could that maybe prevent some confusion down the line and help build a stronger safety culture across everyone who's involved? It's definitely something to consider as you work to, keep things safe in the construction industry.
And hey, thanks for joining us for another deep dive presented by Safety One Source. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks, everyone.